My name is Olivia, and I have a story to share. It all began when I was just a little girl, probably around 5 or 6 years old. That was when my parents' marriage fell apart. My dad, Daniel, just couldn't take it anymore. My mom, Rebecca, had been on his case for years, constantly criticizing him for not making enough money. She never missed an opportunity to belittle him, making him feel worthless. I remember one particular evening Dad came home absolutely thrilled. He had just been promoted at work, and for once he looked genuinely proud of himself. His smile was wide, his eyes bright with excitement. But Mom barely reacted. She simply scoffed and said, "That's it? I thought you had finally found a real job." The light in his eyes faded instantly. It was like watching a balloon deflate. And not long after that he left. Looking back now, I don't blame him. But at the time it felt like my entire world was crumbling. Mom, however, saw things differently. She quickly realized that playing the role of a struggling, abandoned single mother came with advantages. At work, she laid it on thick, using her new narrative to her benefit. "I'm so sorry for being late again, Mr. Palmer," she'd sigh dramatically. Olivia wasn't feeling well and I had no one to help me. Mr. Palmer would respond with sympathetic nods, reassuring her that everything was fine. Meanwhile, I had spent the morning watching cartoons while she fussed over her makeup and hair. Family gatherings were even worse. Mom would sit in the center of attention, weaving exaggerated stories about how Dad had walked out on us with nothing. I would shift uncomfortably in my chair, knowing full well that none of it was true but too afraid to contradict her. Even at that young age, I understood the consequences of challenging her version of events. What no one knew was that Dad never abandoned us completely. Every month he sent money, what he called child support. But whenever the check arrived, Mom would sneer at it, waving it in front of me like an insult. "Look at this, Olivia," she'd scoff. "Your father actually believes this pathetic amount is enough to raise a child." I had no idea how much child support was supposed to be. All I knew was that those checks made Mom angry, and when she was in a bad mood, life became a whole lot harder for me. As the years passed, I started noticing the way she looked at me sometimes. Her eyes would narrow, a flicker of something bitter crossing her face. It took me a long time to understand what it meant. I reminded her too much of Dad. And those memories were not the kind she wanted to keep. Still, she kept me around. I was useful. The image of a struggling single mother and her brave little girl earned her sympathy, special treatment, even some government assistance. But then when I was about 10 years old, everything shifted. That was when Mom met Christopher. He was wealthy, successful, everything she had been waiting for. Suddenly, playing the struggling single mother wasn't as beneficial as it once was. Now she had a new role to step into, the devoted wife of a respectable businessman. And in that picture-perfect life she was curating, I didn't fit in. At first, the changes were subtle. She began to forget to do my laundry, leaving me with nothing clean to wear to school. I'd have no choice but to show up in wrinkled, stained clothes, my cheeks burning as my classmates whispered and pointed. Then the neglect became more deliberate. Mealtimes were the worst. Mom would prepare elaborate, beautifully plated dinners for herself and Christopher, filling the house with the aroma of roasted meat and rich sauces. But when I approached the table, her expression would shift to feigned regret. "Oh, Olivia, I didn't realize you were hungry. There's not enough for 3. Why don't you make yourself a sandwich?" I would quietly retreat to the kitchen, my stomach growling as I threw together a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Through the doorway I could hear their laughter, the clinking of wine glasses, a stark contrast to my meager meal. Then she started tampering with my schoolwork. I'd stay up late finishing an assignment, only to wake up and find it missing the next morning. I had no choice but to go to class empty-handed, stammering through excuses while my teachers gave me concerned looks. My grades began to slip and I could see the pity in their eyes. Meanwhile, Christopher remained oblivious to it all. He was constantly buried in his work, and when he wasn't, his attention was entirely on Mom. She played her part flawlessly, doting on him with sweet words and soft smiles. "Christopher, darling, you work so hard," she'd purr while massaging his shoulders. "You deserve to relax." He would beam at her, utterly enchanted. "What would I do without you, Rebecca?" he'd say. And just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, Mom announced she was pregnant. Christopher was ecstatic. And of course, Mom took full advantage of that newfound joy. "The doctor says I need plenty of rest," Mom would announce from her usual spot on the couch, reclining like royalty. "Be a dear and tidy up the house, won't you?" And so my afternoons were spent scrubbing floors, doing laundry, and making sure everything was spotless while she napped or gossiped with her friends on the phone. By the time Christopher got home, she would suddenly struggle to her feet, placing a delicate hand over the barely visible curve of her stomach. "Oh honey, I'm just exhausted," she'd sigh dramatically. Growing a baby is such hard work. Christopher, ever the devoted husband, would rush to her side, his face full of concern. "Sit down, my love. Olivia, bring your mother some water." Day by day, I felt myself fading further into the background. At school, I withdrew from my friends, too ashamed to invite anyone over. At home, I was little more than a maid, expected to wait on Mom hand and foot. One night, as I lay in bed, listening to her and Christopher excitedly discussing nursery colors and furniture, something inside me snapped. I couldn't do this anymore. With trembling hands, I reached for my phone and did something I had never dared before. I called my dad. Words poured out of me in a flood. I told him everything. The neglect, the manipulation, the overwhelming sense of being unwanted. He listened in silence, his steady breathing the only sign that he was still on the other end of the line. When I finally stopped talking, there was a long pause. Then, his voice came through, firm and certain. "Pack your bags. I'm coming to get you." The next morning I was up before the sun, my heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and fear. My bags had been packed hours ago. I had barely slept, too anxious for what was to come. As I dragged my suitcase downstairs, I heard Mom's voice from the kitchen. "Going somewhere, Olivia?" I froze, bracing for the argument, the guilt trip something. But when I turned, I found her leaning casually against the doorway, a peculiar expression on her face. She looked relieved. "I'm going to live with Dad," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. To my shock, her lips curled into a smile. "Well, it's about time," she said, almost cheerfully. "Christopher and I could use the extra space for the baby." Her words hit me like a slap, but before I could react, a car horn sounded outside. Dad was here. Mom followed me to the door, still wearing that unsettling, almost triumphant smile. "Have a good life, Olivia," she said lightly, waving me off as if she was simply saying goodbye to a distant acquaintance. I glanced back one last time as I walked to Dad's car. She stood there in the doorway, looking happier than she had in years because I was leaving. Dad's apartment was small, but it felt warmer and more welcoming than anywhere I had lived in a long time. However, we wouldn't be there for long. Over the next few months, I watched as Dad's business took off at an unbelievable pace. Every week seemed to bring news of new clients, major deals, and expansions. Within a year, we were house hunting in the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. The home we finally chose was nothing short of breathtaking, 3 stories of sleek modern architecture, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a backyard that looked like something out of a luxury travel magazine. My bedroom alone was larger than our entire old apartment. While Dad buried himself in work, I focused on making our new house a home. I learned to cook gourmet meals, filling the space with delicious aromas. I kept things organized, managed the household staff, and even started a vegetable garden in the backyard. As time passed, Dad's success only grew, and with it, our lives transformed even more. I transferred to the most prestigious private school in the city. On my 16th birthday, Dad handed me a small box. Inside was a set of car keys. A brand new luxury SUV. "Now you can drive yourself to school in style," he said with a grin. "And maybe run a few errands for your old man?" We both laughed, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely happy. As I settled into my new life, thoughts of Mom faded into the background. She never reached out, and I made no effort to reconnect. The wounds were still too fresh, the memories too raw. Instead, I poured my energy into my studies, determined to carve out a future for myself. Years passed, and before I knew it, I was standing on a stage, accepting my college diploma with honors. As I scanned the crowd, searching for the one face that truly mattered, I found him, Dad, standing tall, his pride unmistakable. In that moment, as I looked at him beaming up at me, I felt it, the warmth, the security, the unconditional love I had craved for so long. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be loved. After the ceremony, Dad pulled me aside, a familiar twinkle in his eyes. "I've got something for you," he said, his voice warm with excitement as he handed me a small box. Inside, nestled against the velvet lining, was a single key. "It's for your new apartment. Right in the city center," he added with a smile. "Consider it a graduation gift." Tears welled up in my eyes as I threw my arms around him, holding him tightly. "Thank you, Dad," I whispered. "For everything." A few years had passed since my graduation. My career was flourishing, I had a stunning apartment in the heart of the city, and life was, by all accounts, everything I had ever hoped it would be. Dad and I had settled into a comforting routine. Weekly dinners, long phone calls, and an unspoken understanding that no matter how busy life got, we always made time for each other. Everything felt stable, secure. Until it wasn't. The news struck like lightning from a clear sky. Dad was sick. Cancer. And it was advanced. The doctor's words blurred together, drowning in a wave of medical terminology. But the message was unmistakable. It was bad. From that moment on, my world narrowed to a singular, desperate focus. Saving him. I took an indefinite leave from work, packed my bags, and moved back into his house to care for him. Every waking hour was spent researching treatments, consulting specialists, and chasing every possible avenue that offered even the smallest glimmer of hope. Alternative therapies, experimental drugs, if it could buy us more time, I was willing to try it. The months that followed were an exhausting cycle of hope and heartbreak. On the good days, Dad would sit with me in the garden, sipping tea and reminiscing about the past. On the bad days, of which there were far too many, he could barely get out of bed, racked with pain and sickness from the treatments. One evening, as I helped him back to bed after a particularly difficult day, he turned to me, his eyes filled with something heavier than exhaustion. "Olivia," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to promise me something." I swallowed hard, my throat thick with emotion. "Anything, Dad. Promise me you'll live your life. Really live it. Don't let this hold you back." I wanted to protest, to insist that he was going to get better, that we still had time. But we both knew the truth. So instead I squeezed his hand and whispered, "I promise, Dad." 2 weeks later he was gone. I was by his side when he took his final breath, his hand still resting in mine. I told him I loved him, that I was grateful for everything he had given me. And then, just like that, the man who had been my anchor, my protector, my home was gone. The days that followed passed in a numbing haze. There were arrangements to make, endless details that demanded my attention. The casket, the flowers, the obituary. None of it felt real. It was as if I had stepped outside my own life, watching from a distance as I mechanically went through the motions of planning a funeral. I was at the funeral home, staring blankly at a list of hymns for the service, when my phone buzzed. Unknown number. For a brief second I considered ignoring it. But something made me answer. "Hello." A pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard in years. "Olivia. It's your mother." My stomach clenched. I nearly dropped the phone. After all this time, after years of silence, she was calling now? "What do you want?" I asked, my tone cold, controlled. There was a small, hesitant breath on the other end. "I heard about Daniel," she said softly. "I'm so sorry, sweetie." The word felt foreign, almost mocking coming from her. "I'd like to help," she continued. "With the funeral arrangements, I mean." Every instinct told me to hang up, to tell her exactly where she could shove her sudden concern. But I was exhausted. So exhausted. And deep down, in some forgotten, neglected part of myself, there was still a small wounded child who longed for her mother's comfort. "Okay," I heard myself say. "You can help." As I ended the call, an unsettling feeling settled in my chest. Had I just opened a door that should have stayed closed? Mom arrived at the funeral home an hour later, with my half-brother, Ryan, in tow. He must have been around 13 now, all lanky limbs and awkward movements. I watched as she fussed over him, straightening his tie, smoothing his unruly hair. It was like a punch to the gut. She had never done that for me. Not once. For a moment I struggled to breathe, the weight of old wounds pressing down on me. But I forced myself to push it aside. There were more pressing matters at hand. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice unusually soft. Despite my misgivings, I put her to work. And to my surprise, she handled it all efficiently, coordinating the catering, arranging the flowers, dealing with the endless stream of well-meaning guests. The funeral itself passed in a blur. A procession of unfamiliar faces murmured condolences, their words blending together into a dull hum. Rebecca stayed close, her hand occasionally brushing my arm in what I assumed was meant to be a gesture of comfort. It felt foreign. This sudden maternal presence after a lifetime of absence. As the service came to an end and the crowd began to disperse, she approached me once more. "Olivia," she said hesitantly, glancing down before meeting my eyes. "I know this might not be the best time, but..." She took a deep breath. I'd like to stay in touch. Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime? Her voice was hesitant, almost uncertain. I stared at her, the woman who had made my childhood unbearable, the one who had been all too eager to see me leave. Yet, despite everything, she was the only family I had left. Maybe, I murmured at last. I wasn't sure if she actually meant it, but to my surprise, Rebecca followed through. In the weeks that followed, she called regularly, her voice always carrying a note of concern. How are you holding up, sweetie? She would ask. Is there anything you need? At first, I kept my responses brief, wary of her sudden interest. But as time passed and the weight of my father's absence settled over me, I found myself wanting some form of connection, any connection. Even if it was with Rebecca. Our conversation started off light. She asked about my work, my apartment, the friends I had made. But gradually, the focus of her questions began to shift. Your father's business, she would mention casually. I hope it's not too much of a burden on you. Daniel always worked so hard, she added, as though testing the waters. I dodged the subject whenever I could. The truth was, I was still struggling to grasp the enormity of what my father had left behind. The company, the real estate, the sheer weight of responsibility. And deep down, an instinct sharpened by years of Rebecca's manipulations warned me not to reveal too much. As weeks stretched into months, her subtle hints became more direct. Ryan is looking at universities, she mentioned in passing one afternoon. The tuition fees these days are just outrageous. I honestly don't know how we're going to afford it. I responded with a vague murmur, my guard immediately up. Another time she sighed and said, Christopher's job has been uncertain lately. The economy is just so unstable. It's affecting everyone. No matter what we talked about, the conversation always seemed to circle back to financial struggles, the silent expectation hanging thick in the air. Despite my better judgment, Rebecca's persistent show of motherly concern began to wear me down. Slowly, I started offering small financial help. It began innocently enough, paying for Ryan's SAT prep courses, buying Rebecca a new laptop when hers broke, covering 1 month's rent when Christopher's company faced difficulties. You're such an angel, Olivia, Rebecca would gush. I don't know what we'd do without you. Each time a strange warmth filled my chest. Was this what it meant to have a real family? Meanwhile, I poured my energy into managing my father's company. I appointed his longtime deputy as director, keeping ownership and the authority to make major decisions. The work was demanding, but every time I sat in my father's old office, I felt connected to him in a way I never had before. As time went on, Rebecca's requests became more frequent and more demanding. What had once been the occasional favor transformed into something dangerously close to an obligation. The final straw came on a bright Tuesday afternoon. I was buried in quarterly reports when my phone rang. Olivia, darling. Rebecca's voice was syrupy sweet. We've been thinking. It's been so long since we've had a proper family vacation. We found this incredible deal for a European tour. A sinking feeling formed in my stomach. Rebecca, I don't know. It would mean the world to Ryan, she cut in, her tone insistent. And after everything we've been through, don't you think we deserve a little happiness? Guilt clashed with resentment, and before I fully processed it, I had agreed to pay for their trip. But of course it didn't end there. The day after they returned, Rebecca was on the phone again. Now about Ryan's college fund, she said, this time without any sugary pretense. We'll need you to set that up immediately. He's got his heart set on Princeton, you know. Something inside me snapped. Years of neglect, of emotional manipulation, of feeling like nothing more than a resource to be exploited. It all surged to the surface. No, I said, my voice trembling but firm. No more, Mom. I'm done. Silence stretched between us before Rebecca finally spoke, her voice ice cold. After everything we've done for you? You ungrateful little parasite. How dare you turn your back on your family? A bitter laugh escaped me. Family? You mean the mother who was thrilled to see me leave? The one who made my childhood a nightmare? The conversation escalated fast. Rebecca abandoned any pretense of warmth, unleashing a torrent of accusations and insults. I didn't hold back either. Years of suppressed anger, of unspoken words came rushing out in waves. You're just like your father, she spat, her voice filled with venom. Selfish and heartless. Thank God for that, I shot back. At least he loved me. Then nothing. The call had ended. I stood there, my phone clutched in my hand, my entire body shaking. The silence that followed was deafening. When the opportunity for a month-long business trip abroad arose, I seized it without hesitation. A chance to step away, clear my mind, and regain some perspective. Exactly what I needed. As I boarded the plane, an unexpected sense of relief washed over me. As if I were leaving behind more than just a city. Maybe this was what I had been searching for. Distance and time to sort through the chaos. After 4 exhausting weeks, I was more than ready to return home. The trip had been productive, but all I longed for was the familiarity of my own space, the comfort of my own bed. I could already imagine the moment I'd finally kick off my shoes and just breathe. But as I slid my key into the lock, something felt wrong. The door swung open and I froze. This wasn't my apartment. My carefully curated furniture, my personal touches. Everything was gone, replaced by unfamiliar decor. A couple sat on the couch, their expressions mirroring my own shock. "Who are you?" I demanded, my heart hammering. "What are you doing in my apartment?" The man stood slowly, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Your apartment," he repeated. "We bought this place a few weeks ago. From a woman named Rebecca, I think?" The ground beneath me seemed to shift. Rebecca? My mother? No. That wasn't possible. "There must be some mistake," I said, my voice unsteady. "I never sold this apartment. I've been out of the country." The couple exchanged uncertain glances. "We have all the paperwork," the woman said cautiously. "Maybe you should check with your realtor?" I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind struggling to make sense of it all. My first instinct was to call the police to report a fraud. But another thought surfaced. A bitter voice in my head whispering that I already knew who was responsible. I needed to hear it from her. With trembling hands, I dialed Rebecca's number. It rang once, twice. Then her voice, sweet and familiar, filled the silence. "Hello, Olivia. How was your trip?" I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Cut the act, Mom. What did you do to my apartment?" A pause. Then, to my utter disbelief, she laughed. A slow, condescending chuckle that sent ice through my veins. "Oh, Olivia," she sighed, amusement dripping from every word. "If you had just been willing to share your wealth, none of this would have been necessary. You really brought this on yourself." The betrayal hit me like a punch to the gut. "You sold my apartment?" My voice cracked. "How could you?" "I'll go to the police, You'll what?" Rebecca interrupted, her tone sharp now, the warmth gone. "Report your own mother? Please. We both know you don't have the nerve for that." The call ended. I stood there on the sidewalk, phone clenched in my hand, the weight of her words pressing down on me. But this time something inside me refused to break. Rebecca was so sure I wouldn't fight back. She was wrong. Without hesitation, I flagged down a cab and gave the driver Rebecca and Christopher's address. By the time I reached their house, fury had overtaken the shock. I pounded on the door, my adrenaline surging. Christopher answered, his face etched with confusion. "Olivia? What's going on?" I pushed past him, my voice shaking with rage. "Where's Rebecca?" He blinked. "She's out." "What's this about?" I didn't hold back. I laid it all out, the apartment, Rebecca's confession, every horrifying detail. As I spoke, I watched the color drain from his face. "But that's impossible," he stammered, rubbing his temple. "We don't need money for Ryan's education. I already set aside funds for that." We stared at each other as the reality dawned. With unsteady hands, Christopher pulled out financial documents, credit card statements, bank records. As we pored over them, the full extent of Rebecca's deception emerged. Hidden loans, maxed out credit cards, a mountain of secret debt. "I had no idea," Christopher whispered, his voice hollow. "All this time." A strange mixture of vindication and pity settled over me. He had been deceived just as much as I had. But I had no sympathy left for Rebecca. This wasn't just personal. This was fraud. I made the call without hesitation. As soon as I hung up with the authorities, a strange sense of relief flooded me. For too long I had been her victim. Not anymore. The investigation was relentless, uncovering more than I had ever imagined. Rebecca hadn't just forged my signature to sell my apartment. She had been living a double life. Credit card statements painted a sickening picture: extravagant shopping sprees, luxury vacations, five-star hotels, spa treatments, all hidden behind a carefully constructed web of lies. Christopher had been blind to it all. The trial became a media spectacle, reporters swarming the courthouse, eager to dissect every scandalous detail. I hated the attention, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction of watching Rebecca's carefully crafted facade crumble. In the end, justice prevailed. The judge's words echoed in my mind. Mrs. Rebecca Foster, your actions demonstrate a blatant disregard for the law and an egregious betrayal of your family's trust. You are hereby sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to repay the full amount obtained through fraudulent means to Olivia Foster. Christopher, still reeling, called me the day after the sentencing. His voice was rough, heavy with emotion. Olivia. I'm filing for divorce, he said. And I'm seeking full custody of Ryan. After everything she's done, I can't let her near him. In the aftermath, I rebuilt my life from the ground up. The money from the apartment was returned, and I used it to buy a small house on the outskirts of the city, a fresh start, on my own terms. I dedicated myself to running my father's company, honoring his legacy in the best way I knew how. The work was demanding, but fulfilling. For the first time, I felt truly independent. Ryan and I kept in touch. He was in college now, studying engineering, with Christopher's full support. It was bittersweet, but I was grateful we had a chance at a real relationship. And as for Rebecca? I haven't heard from her since the trial. I don't know if she's tried to reach out, and honestly, I don't care. That chapter of my life is closed.